Michael, in my searching to discern whether there is a God and what religion may be right, I appreciate the work that you've done in taking really hard problems and focusing on them, not pushing under the rug. And one of the fascinating ones is the question of, assuming there is evolution and God is a good and perfect God, we know that there is just unbelievable misery and suffering that animals have gone through during the evolutionary process. Now, in addition to that, there's species that go extinct, and you can say that that's less than some good. Of their good might be all species should live, but certainly the bone-crushing misery, and we know from the animal world there's so much, from our perspective, so much suffering. You've tried to deal with this. And so what are some of the ways of thinking that you can solve this problem? Try to solve it.
Sure. Well, so the way I've thought about this problem is in the context of someone trying to generate an argument for atheism. So the person making this argument points to this significant amount of suffering on the part of animals and says there's no morally sufficient reason for God to permit something like that, and therefore there can't be a God. And it's important to set it up in that way because I think, let me just say up front, I haven't the slightest idea why God permits animals to suffer. And I don't really intend to provide an answer to that question, even in the book that I wrote on the topic. What I did instead was to ask, are there reasons that we can point to that undermine that atheistic argument? And so what would it take to undermine an argument like that? And the answer is what you need is something, you need to be able to point to something that, as far as you know, isn't false. And if it were true, it would explain how the existence of animal suffering and the existence of God are compatible. So you might think about it by way of an illustration. Let's say that, I think my wife is faithful to me, and she tells me she's going on a trip to New York. And that evening, a friend of mine flies back to Philadelphia, and we meet, and he says, I saw your wife sitting in a romantic restaurant in the corner holding hands with this guy in Boston. And I say, gosh, that's not what I thought was happening. She told me she was going up to visit her uncle in New York. So what should I conclude from that? We might think what you should conclude is that your wife's being unfaithful to you and she's lying to you about where she is. But, I really don't think she's unfaithful. And, she does have a nephew that lives in Boston, and his wife was sick. I wonder if maybe she got some news that things didn't go well and she ended up going to Boston but hasn't yet told me. Maybe that's what it is. The question is it okay for me to continue to believe that my wife is faithful to me in the face of that sort of evidence if, for all I know, she's actually visiting her nephew and that's who this person saw? I think the answer is yes. So all I needed to maintain the reasonability of my belief is some alternative explanation that I don't know is false, and that would be sufficient to undermine the infidelity argument, let's say. So the same thing would be true here. If someone presents me with evidence for something that looks like it counts against the existence of God, if I have some explanation for how that could be the case, that I don't know is false, that seems to be sufficient to preserve the reasonability of my belief, at least until I learned something more.
I follow you except for the word sufficient. You have to come up with arguments that at least are in the same ballpark of assumed a priori probability. You can't come up with something so crazily wild that there are aliens on Mars who have manipulated the brains of animals. That's
right.
Possible, but that's beyond the capability.
So the standard I set is something like this: that it has to be the case that given the things that we accept, we don't have sufficient reason to reject that thing. So you might say, well, given the things that I accept, I have good reason to reject that there are these little green men that might provide the explanation. But in the case of my wife and the nephew, I don't have any reason to reject it. I don't have any reason to accept it, by the way, but I don't have any reason to reject it either. Okay. So that's the starting point for this, I think, for this conversation. And so now we're asking, well, are there explanations of that sort? And I think there are three different kinds of explanations that you might offer. So the first is questioning just how much suffering is going on when it comes to the animal realm. And if it turns out that there's not as much as we thought, well, that at least decreases the problem of animal suffering. So I'll say something more about that in a minute. Second one is you might say, well, no, animal suffering is a reality, but just like the suffering that we talk about in the context of thinking about the problem of evil in other domains, there might be some morally sufficient reason why God permits it, and then we'd have to say something about what that morally sufficient reason is. And it might be, so this is 2A of these alternatives, maybe that morally sufficient reason has to do with some good that accrues to the animals themselves, right? So the suffering that they experience, there is some sufficiently good reason for it to happen, and that sufficiently good reason has to do with overriding goods that those animals experience as a result of the permitted suffering.
The individual animals or the species?
Either one. And the reason I put those both together is because the third alternative is to say, well, look, the suffering of animals is permitted, and there is some overriding good that comes from that, but it's not a good that accrues to the animals themselves. It's a good that accrues to the cosmos as a whole, or maybe to human beings or something like that. So I think those are the three different options. So let me say something about the first one first. We just don't know what the conscious lives of non-human animals is like.
Well, we don't know what the conscious lives of our fellow humans are like for the same reason. The problem of other minds, and we only know our own internal sense.
But we do
have
know
a lot
this.
of parallels. You and I have a lot of parallels.
That's right.
But when I see a monkey and a monkey brain and a dolphin brain, it's not a whole lot of difference.
That's true. And so the question is that a sufficient reason to think that their experience is the same? And the answer to that is still that we don't know. So here's one thing we do know. We know that at least some Homo sapiens experience phenomenal consciousness. I know that because I'm one, and I experience it. And it may be the case that I can't demonstrate that you have the same thing that I do, but I know that I have it. So we know that at least one species has it. Then the question is, do we know that about the other species? And the answer is, we don't really know that. And it's a challenge. I mean, many philosophers have pointed this out. It's a challenge to figure out what would be a sufficient signal that there are these phenomenally conscious states, and especially in the case of noxious stimuli, pain states, in non-human animals.
We have similar reactions. You have the reflex, screaming, crying,
withdrawing your limbs from the noxious stimulus, and so on.
There aren't any demonstrable physical differences that you can say. But the question you're asking is the question of knowledge of other minds.
That's right. And so, when you say, well, look, there are similar behavioral reactions in the face of these, what are called noxious stimuli, something that causes you or has a tendency to cause injury. That's certainly true. And presumably, there's good evolutionary reasons why there are the behavioral responses that we see when it comes to the experience of a noxious stimulus. But what we don't know is what's going on the inside. And actually, just parenthetically, I think that points to a really difficult issue when it comes to evolution and the nature of mind, and that is why phenomenal consciousness? It actually doesn't seem to play any valuable role.
Yeah, that's a huge other subject.
It is, but here's why it's relevant here, because...
No, it is relevant, I agree.
Because you might say, well, look, if there's no discernible role for phenomenal consciousness, then when it comes to other organisms, should we assume that they do or don't have it? Like, where's the burden of proof? I actually don't know for sure what the answer is, but one might say, gosh, the burden of proof is on the one who wants to say that phenomenal consciousness actually is present in these other organisms. Because since we can't figure out any discernible fitness-enhancing role that it has, we should assume that it's not there until we have a reason to think that it is there.
That's a stretch, but...
Well, but it's also true when you look at different theories of consciousness that have been proposed by philosophers. There's reason to think that at least organisms that don't have a pretty sophisticated level of cognitive apparatus don't have phenomenal consciousness. So, for example, higher-order thought theories of consciousness hold that in order for you to have a phenomenally conscious state, you need to have a second-order mental state that has as its object a first-order mental state.
A self-awareness kind of.
That's right.
That I know I am I.
That's right. And there's not, well, it may not even require quite that much, but anyway, that's the basic idea. And it's worth pointing out that there's a lot of cognitive sophistication involved in having higher-order thoughts. And so at least that seems to indicate that organisms that don't have that kind of cognitive sophistication wouldn't be phenomenally conscious if that theory is true. Now, it may not be true, right? But
so let's go on to 2 and 3.
Okay, so 2 and 3. So on the second view, the idea is that there is some overriding good that comes from the permission of animal suffering, and that overriding good accrues to the animals themselves. So what might that be? There's a variety of different proposals, but here's one that I think maybe is more interesting than some of the others. So any embodied organism that engages in intentional behavior, trying to achieve some particular goal, has to have some mechanism in place that prevents it from bodily injury, at least bodily injury that will prevent it from reaching its goals or perhaps causing its own death. And so there needs to be some mechanism, like the pain mechanism, that says, stop what you're doing, because what you're doing is injuring yourself in a way that will prevent you from reaching your goal. And the pain mechanism looks like it's a very effective way of doing that. the question is, are there other ways of doing it that don't involve the kind of pain and the sort of evil that we think pain is? And there's some reason to think actually that the answer is no. So research that's been done on human beings who have Hansen's disease, which actually causes the inability to feel pain in the peripheral digits, right? They've tried various ways to try to supplement that, providing people with pressure-sensitive gloves that cause a sound appear in your ear, or you see a little light flashing. And it turns out that doesn't actually deter people.
But in the vast numbers of those hundreds of millions or billions or trillions of animals who've suffered, who had that pain reaction, they could have escaped. It didn't escape.
That's true. So, but again, the question is there some good that accrues from the permission of that sort of suffering? And the answer is yes. Organisms that engage in intentional behavior.
But to the trillions of animals that have been destroyed and felt the pain in that process, that didn't help them.
Well, it might have helped them during many parts of their life, right? But at the moment of their death, for example, it won't help you in that case.
So number 3.
Okay, so number 3 is when you think that the kind of pain and suffering that animals experience brings about a greater good, but it's not a greater good for them. So what might that be? And so if we think of the trajectory of evolution as going from simple single-celled organisms to many types of complex organisms, including human beings, which for Christians they think is especially important because they manifest the image of God. And this process happens in a law-like way. So it happens from simplicity to complexity, and it happens in a law-like way. Then it looks like you have to traverse through increasingly sophisticated degrees of complexity organismically over time. And what that seems to require is that there be intermediate organisms that will have many of the features, many of the cognitive mental features that we have, but maybe not all of them. And among those are going to be the ability to experience phenomenally conscious states. So if it's a greater good that there be organisms like us, then, and it's necessary that we pass through these less sophisticated stages of evolution, it might be the case that those organisms exist and are capable of feeling this kind of pain and suffering because that's a necessary condition for getting us. Now, there are a lot of people who don't like that view for a lot of reasons. One, because they don't think that this kind of law-like trajectory is necessary. The other, because they don't think it's just for other organisms to suffer for the greater good of creatures like us.